Hello, my name is Stephanie Wiles and I'm the director of the Johnson Museum of Art, and it's really a pleasure today to be engaged with the new 2013 New Student Reading Project. So what our goal is at the museum is to constantly work to find ways to engage students and faculty and visitors in interdisciplinary approaches to works of art. So it's a challenge for us, as well as a challenge for the students and their faculty mentors to think about the book, and this year it's When the Emperor Was Divine, and consider ways that we can connect students in first-hand conversations with original works of art. So if you look at the painting that's behind me, it's by Roger Shimomura, a Japanese-American artist, and kind of documents his engagement with the Minidoka relocation camp, where he and his family spent time during World War II. In a little bit, you'll hear from my colleagues in other galleries talking about Roger's work, but the idea behind this was to say to students who are just coming to classes, to Cornell for the first time, is to say that they will be learning in laboratories, they'll be learning from textual analysis in English classes, and the museum is just another classroom, a classroom where they can learn just as much, but perhaps not reading a text, but actually visually interpreting a text. So what we'll see from here on in is how we don't expect students to come with preconceived notions or knowledge of the works that we have on view for them today with Roger Shimomura or some of the other artists, but that what we do is we expect them to look carefully, to think about what messages these works of art might have and how they relate to really, really critical and important themes in When the Emperor Was Divine.
I'm Sarah Ferguson. I'm the coordinator of public programs here at the museum. So here we have an example of a very large painting by Roger Shimomura, and one of the things that's really important to think about is that this is done on 3 different panels. So formally that relates back to the Japanese screen. We can also relate that to the Japanese screens are often depicting images of landscapes as well as are done from a bird's eye view. And so we here see that he has done a bird's eye view of an internment camp. But one of the really interesting things about the foreground and the middle ground and the background is the hierarchy that's sometimes set up with the foreground. And we have these black clouds. So we also know that the background is blue skies, desert, it is not raining. So these black clouds create an ominous sort of presence, dreariness, or the feeling of oppression that the internment camp, Japanese Americans who were in the internment camp were subject to. Roger Shimomura talks about the black clouds as being related to the anger that Roosevelt at the time felt when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And so going back and forth between the feelings of oppression and I would assume anger that the internment camp individuals felt, as well as the anger and the fear that the Americans felt, can be realized in this. Another relationship that this painting can create to the book that we've all read is that when you look at the characters being depicted here, we have no actual characteristic identities. We know that they're Japanese Americans that are in the internment camp. We know that they're American soldiers standing in the foreground above them with weapons. But just like the book, we don't know their names. We don't know their individual characteristics other than young or old or male or female. And so that level of lack of identity can sort of lead us into how this kind of situation could arise, how could America, fearing its freedoms, deny freedoms from individuals that were American. So in contrast to the last painting we saw, these 2 paintings on this wall in the same gallery have a really strong sense of identity. We have the figure here who gives a sense of pride, a sense of strength. She's wearing makeup, she's in a beautiful dress, and she's making eye contact with the viewer, which is really important. I've had a number of students through discussion talk about how this figure reminds them of the mother in the book, and how the mother mentioned to her children as they walked away from their home to always keep your head up, to never look back. but that the mother had a sadness in her eyes. And I think that that relationship of maybe a sadness behind this figure is because she's standing in front of the barrack bathrooms, which we know probably didn't have running water, and that when you're dressed in the best and you're going out for a dance and then you're reminded of the fact that you're still in prison and that your freedoms have been taken away, I think it lends that sadness into our eyes. And over here we have an example of a beautiful flower, the chameleon and the irises, which many students in discussion have related back to the scene in the book where the man reaches for the flower and then is shot and killed. Others have related this to when they're driving or when they're traveling by train and they can see the outside world. In this image, you can see that the artist has taken most of the composition and it's blackened. So we know that the outside world is just unattainable. It's just on the other side that they can't grasp.
I'm Nancy Green. I am the Gail and Ira Drucker Curator of European and American Art between 1800 and 1945. And one of the things I want to talk about today is the use of the color woodcut as a traditional medium in Japan and how that is reflected in what we read in the book. Now this set of prints is a perfect example of how a print is made in Japan, although this set of prints was actually made by an Austrian artist. In the first print you see a man drawing a design on a piece of paper. He is the artist. He is the one who is given credit for the whole process of making the print. But as soon as he's finished with his drawing, he hands it off to the woodblock cutter. And the woodblock cutter then will cut a series of blocks, one for each color, and then he hands off these carved blocks to the man who is the printer. And the printer will then register each print, send it, and hand print each color. And he has to do this over and over and over again. It takes a lot of time to produce one print and to do them over and over because they are multiples. Now the only person who is given the credit for producing these prints is, as I said, the designer. And the block cutter and the printer are anonymous. And this is very common in Japanese art, where the artist or the artisan who makes a work of art is the one who doesn't necessarily always have their name put on an object. And that doesn't mean it's not a good object because it's not signed. It just means that the artist took pleasure in the actual making and felt satisfied with what he had created. If it was a beautiful object, that was the reward, not being recognized for having created the beautiful object. So in the book, the figures in the book are anonymous. We know them because of their voices, and that's how we get to recognize them, is through their voices. But what's important is their story, just as what's important in the works of art is the final product and what is the beautiful product that results from making a woodcut or a piece of pottery or a scroll or to creating a piece of lacquer. So why don't we go into the next room? And we'll look at some other works of art. So what I've just described are the traditional ukiyo-e woodcuts, and we do know that Roger Shimomura was and is very influenced by ukiyo-e woodcuts, and I think you can see that in these 4 prints that are by Hiroshige. And in many ways he's set up his framework for his paintings in the way that the ukiyo-e artists did. They have something very strong, very distinct on the frontal plane, particularly in this one of the iris. It acts almost as a barrier to the viewer, as the barbed wire does in the paintings. But there's something else that's very important about these 4 prints, and they represent the 4 seasons of the year. The one at the top left represents spring, and we know that because we have this lovely spring green color and this renewal and rebirth of the land, but also because of the cherry blossoms which come out in spring. In the summer we have the iris, our summer flower, but what we can see in the background is we can see these women gathering the iris, and usually these women would come to the iris fields and collect iris and then bring them to the market in Edo and sell them. So that's the summer season, and then fall is an obvious one because we have red maples here as well. And this red maple motif shows up again in European art, we have this lovely little silver sugar bowl, and that was done by a British artist, but he uses the motif of the maple leaf on the side of the sugar bowl. And then in winter, we have the crane, and we know this is a winter scene. The red-headed crane is the national bird, or the symbol in Japan, and it is an endangered species, and it's been recognized in Japan as an endangered species for centuries. So they would have these sanctuaries where the cranes would reside, and in the winter months, when the cranes couldn't find food naturally, they would have a gamekeeper who would come and bring them food, and that figure is in the background carrying the 2 loads of grain on his shoulder. So the caveat to this was once a year, the samurai would come to the sanctuary and they would have a crane shoot, and the first crane shot would be presented to the emperor as a recognition in honor of his position as emperor. Now, I think what's really important about these images, and the fact that in most Japanese prints, particularly in ukiyo-e woodcuts, which are images of the floating world, one of the main themes is about landscape and respect for nature. And you can see that in the little bits that you can picture in Roger Shimomura's work, and you can also see that in the book. There are 2 instances where the young boy does something with nature. And the first is that he acquires a turtle. And the turtle in Japan is the symbol of longevity because they have long lives. So this is something that he relates to and he has as a pet. And I think that that's something that all children do, is they want something that's something of their own. And the other thing that appears in the book is the scene in which there's a flower, a single flower. Here he is in the middle of a desert landscape, and yet he hones in on this one flower. And I think that again speaks to the Japanese relationship with nature.
Hello, my name is Carrie O'Mara. I'm the Mellon Coordinator for Student Engagement here at the Johnson Museum. I'm here specifically for students and working with the Museum Club with social events, the Student Docent Program coordinating tours and workshops for students. There's a lot of offerings here at the Johnson Museum specifically for students, and if you're ever interested, our website provides that information. We looked at 2 specific pieces in this gallery here, and one is titled Classmates, created in 2007. If we visually look at the piece, just what sort of jumps right off first are 2 girls. They're very similar in their positioning. They're both holding an apple in their hand, smiling rather broadly, dressed in similar, very flouncy, decorative dresses with hair embellishments. So they look very much similar, and given that the title is called Classmates, you can sort of envision that they might have been friends, similar social circles, interest, and almost as you can see, the all-American girl, American Pie, apple for teacher, and that they're friends and that they're both Americans. But when you look at this a little bit further and longer, what you tend to notice is actually that we have something running across the image, and that's barbed wire. You'll see that present throughout a lot of Roger Shimomura's pieces. But what you notice is that the barbed wire is behind our girl that is very classically all-American, and then our Japanese American, her face is actually being sliced in a sense by the barbed wire. She's being dissected and separated from this other girl. So that really sort of reflects on how in the book, if you recall, that when the girl went back to school, she was really separated from the rest of her classmates. That she was their friends and her classmates before she left, and when she came back, she was somebody else, somebody separated from this camp and from this war and from this time. So that's really being represented with this piece right here. So moving on to another piece of Roger Shimomura's in the study gallery is this one right here. It's called Furlough, also from 2007. Visually, it's similar to the one we just looked at. We have 2 figures positioned right next to each other. But the thing that you'll notice right off the bat is different between these two pieces is that instead of having one person on one side of the barbed wire and one on the other, they're both imprisoned and cut off visually by barbed wire. When you look at this man right here, you can easily identify with who he is. He's a United States soldier. And you might recall during the book that there was this section where every person in the camp had to fill out a survey about their allegiance to America. And I believe that someone answered no, and they were sent back to Japan. And so what this talks about is those soldiers who did enlist and were sent overseas to fight the war. And what is poignant about this piece is that those soldiers, those Japanese Americans who fought and died for their country, when they came back on leave, instead of being able to spend time with their family, abroad, they were forced back into the camps, just like prisoners. And so you see a wife who's very much happy to see her husband home from leave, but he's being treated no differently than a prisoner of war. So what we have here in this case really illustrates how the camps were trying to forget kind of what was going on. And so there was high schools in each of the camps, and what we have here is a yearbook that was given to the graduating classes. If going through, you could see there's softball teams, a lifeguard team, and it was a way to try to bring together in a sense of community, even though they were imprisoned. We also have an image of Roger Shimomura as a child with his mother and his father, in trying to enjoy the snow and kind of bring back childhood as much as possible.
I'm Kathy Klimaszewski, and I'm Curator of Education and Associate Director at the Johnson Museum. And we're looking at a painting in the Visible Storage Gallery by Roger Shimomura. This is a depiction of a young girl jumping rope in shadow. And in the very basic shapes and forms, he has brought her to life in front of the barracks, where the tar paper and the board and batten is accentuated, and her shadow is cast against the outside of this building. One interesting point about this painting is that in Japanese prints, the shadow was often used to portray a demon who had disguised itself and would then reveal its true identity. And in this piece, we see her as an enemy, and the title of this is The Shadow of the Enemy. Her pigtails, as she's jumping rope, almost take on the likeness of horns. And we begin to think about how the Japanese Americans were demonized by the public because of the fear and the racial prejudice. And even children could be seen as an enemy of the state. We're also reminded of a passage in the book where she comes home from school and she has her jump rope with her. And her brother sees her coming in, and she cuts her jump rope up into tiny pieces and she throws it away because she had wanted to jump rope with the other girls, and they had not let her. She could only hold the rope. She could not be included in the jumping. So once again, we're reminded of separation, of alienation, as we also are in the formal aspects of the painting, which are reminiscent of prison bars that we see over and over again in Shimomura's painting, or we might be looking through a screen of barbed wire. So a very effective composition with a very powerful message. This is a quilt that was made in Poston, Camp Poston in Arizona. And you can see that the women in Miss Thompson's sewing class actually made individual blocks with their names on them, embroidered with messages and well wishes, memories of Poston. Undoubtedly, they gave this piece when they were done to their teacher, Miss Thompson, who ran a sewing class in the camp. What I find really interesting about this piece is that in this dismal environment where there really was not much for them to do, the arts and crafts seemed to flourish. And the women were participating in an American tradition that goes back 150 years to the middle of the 19th century, when women were making friendship and signature quilts all across America, and still do today. And they make these quilts and they give them to friends, to respected teachers, to family members, as a way to keep bonds together. And this is so a uniquely American tradition that the women were being involved in, and we think about the importance of assimilation and acculturation in the book, and how many instances this comes up. We think about the mother when she burns the photographs, when she burns the kimonos that she brought from Japan to destroy the evidence of her heritage, and how compelling that scene is. So we understand Roger's desire to collect what's left and to serve as a memorial to this very dark period in America's history. In this painting by Roger Shimomura, we see him dressed as a cowboy when he was 3 or 4 years old, living in the Minidoka internment camp in Utah. He has the cowboy boots, the vest, the hat, the lasso, and this sort of cocky expression on his face. So he is an American cowboy. And we think again about how important it was for the internees to become acculturated and assimilate into American society in terms of their dress, even in terms of the foods they ate. And we remember passages in the book where his mother would send them to school with peanut butter sandwiches and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and not rice balls. Again, he's placed in front of the tar paper and the board and batten siding. And we're again reminded of this need to become an American in every sense of the word, in dress, in embracing the cultural ideas. And right next to him on the ground, we see a little Japanese toy. So we're also reminded of his Japanese heritage and that part of his background. So it's a very interesting little painting. And one of the things I think it's good to remember is that Roger probably started thinking about being an artist when he was a young child. He mentions that in drawing, he could visualize the things he couldn't have. He could look at a Sears Roebuck catalog and think about the cowboy boots or the cowboy hat that he couldn't have, but he could draw them. And the drawing took him to a magical state of mind. And I think this is what art did for many of the internees at the camps. It allowed them to endure hardship and to move forward.
My name is Ellen Averill. I'm the Chief Curator and Curator of Asian Art here at the Johnson Museum. And in this gallery, we're looking at 4 paintings by Roger Shimomura that expose the feelings of being incarcerated in one of the internment camps. Roger Shimomura's earliest childhood memories were in the prison camp in Minidoka in Idaho. And a lot of his work throughout his career has focused on the experiences of him and his family, his parents, his grandparents, and him as a third-generation Japanese American living in one of these camps for 3 years during World War II. So the paintings in this gallery all have a similar theme of being nighttime scenes. One shows 2 of the guards in the watchtower looking at various people throughout the camp, and we just see the glow of lights in the windows of the barracks. And this shows that, you know, people, even when they're trying to go about all their activities of their daily lives, are under surveillance and being watched all the time. So related to the novel, we talked about those feelings of humiliation during the incarceration, the lack of privacy, and the feelings of fear and always being watched. There's also a painting in this gallery that shows one guard watching a barracks where a dance is taking place, and there's a small window of a dancing couple, and the artist shows us everything of the couple except for their faces. And so it points out how these could be any Americans of the time who are enjoying popular culture of the time, popular dance of that time. But it's only because this couple is Japanese American that they've been imprisoned. And then there's one painting that shows a whole group of men standing in line waiting for the latrine. And it shows men of all walks of life and all ages, from very young children up to older men, and even one Japanese American who is a member of the US military, and who must have been on furlough, and when he came back for a break from military service, he was placed in one of the internment camps. And in this painting, we see only one person who is looking out at the viewer, and that is a self-portrait of the artist as a toddler when he was living at Minidoka. And then the fourth painting in the gallery shows just a portion of a couple having intercourse. And the title of the painting is Dawn of the Sansei, which refers to the conception of a third generation Japanese American, which is occurring in the internment camp. And is a reference to Roger Shimomura's own family's experience, where his youngest sister was born in one of the camps. And in that picture, he also makes reference to a genre of traditional Japanese woodblock prints culture that show erotic scenes of lovemaking. Those are called shonga. So that's also a reference that he makes to traditional Japanese culture and art forms.
My name is Carol Hockett, and I'm coordinator of school programs here at the Johnson Museum of Art. I'm up on the 5th floor of the museum in the Japanese gallery, and I'm surrounded here by all kinds of objects. I'm surrounded by paintings and scrolls, sculpture, ceramics, hanging scrolls, and baskets as well. Some of these objects are hundreds of years old. Others of them are less than 10 years old, but they all share a common aesthetic. It's a great place to begin to explore Asian art at the museum, and also a great place to make connections back to the freshman read when the emperor was divine. I asked students yesterday in our discussions if they had to talk about the book and just simply use one word to describe it, what would that word be? The answers were telling and fascinating. The words they chose were minimal and sparse and poetic and empty and spare. And if you look around the gallery at these objects, I think you could see that maybe some of those very same words would help us to describe Japanese art in this gallery. If you look, for example, at this piece of Mount Fuji, I think you'll see a sense of simplicity and minimalism and quiet and elegance that really seems to characterize the book as well. The author not only gives us this story of a Japanese family enduring the hardships of the internment camp, but in a sense, the style and the form of that book are also very Japanese in their feel. I'm going to show you an object from the Education Department collection that is a mask from the Japanese theater, from the No tradition, N-O-H. This mask is a piece that I showed to freshmen yesterday and asked them again if they might see connections between this mask and the book itself. Many saw this as an interesting comparison to the figure of the mother in the book and her need to suppress her own emotions and, in a sense, wear a mask throughout the short novel. Another student brought up the fact that this is, in a sense, a universal or a generic image of a mother or a female, and felt that was something important in the book as well. that the mother really never even had a name, but instead stood for somehow the essence of the maternal and what this woman was experiencing. Another fascinating thing about this piece, this is again worn in the Japanese no theater tradition, is that by subtly moving the mask, the actor is able to give you a variety of emotions. Again, it's very subtle, just like the book, and something that rewards careful and patient looking, just as you'll find in the novel that the freshmen read this year. I hope soon you will come and explore the 5th floor of the museum and the rest of the spectacular collections. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alana Ryder. I'm the Mellon Curatorial Coordinator for Academic Programs at the Johnson, and we are outside in the Morgan Japanese Garden, and this was one of the stops on the reading project last Sunday. The Japanese Garden was designed by Cornell alumnus Mark Keene, and it was inspired by a 17th century scroll in the permanent collection. And the scroll depicts a Chinese legend called the Three Laughers of the Tiger Glen. And Mark Keene interpreted that legend into this great space that was part of the 2011 addition to the museum. In order to connect this space to the book When the Emperor Was Divine, students sat around and took in the landscape and discussed the different natural elements, many of which were brought in to Ithaca from different places. The Japanese red pine and the rocks are from Connecticut, and much like the students, they came a long distance to be here and tell the story of the Three Laughers. The three boulders stand for the Buddhist monk, a Taoist priest, and a Confucian poet. And the story goes that the Buddhist monk vowed to never leave the land of the temple, but one day his two friends visited him, and they were so immersed in discussion that they ended up walking over the bridge across the Tiger Glen, and in the end they burst into laughter because they had crossed boundaries and territory, and they were having such a pleasant time in discussion that they had overcome differences and boundaries that the Buddhist had set for himself. So I asked students to consider this landscape, the garden, in terms of the changing setting of the book that they were reading. And we looked at the garden, and then through the glass you can see one of Shimomura's paintings of one of the internment camps. So I asked students to think about the setting and the landscape of the novel almost as its own character, something that the boy and the girl missed so much were green grass and the wind blowing through trees. And I asked students to also think about what they miss about their homes and connect a garden, a memory to their own, the places where they came from. One of the great observations that a student came up with was that from very far away, it looks like there are just two types of moss in this garden. It looks quite homogeneous and uniform altogether. And upon closer examination, there are a great variety of mosses in the garden. There are actually a dozen. And so we spoke about that in terms of different populations during the war, and how from a distance or from far away, one population can look so similar, and again, connecting to them, sometimes students from far away look quite the same. So we took a lot of time to look at the details. Another great feature is this this river that does not have any water flowing through it, but we discussed how an artist interprets and abstracts forms, and this was done through stones that were set on their edges to give the effect of gushing water through this ravine. In closing, this was a great afternoon to introduce students to the resources of the Johnson Museum, and also to show them a place that hopefully inspires contemplative thought, relaxation, and enjoyment of their new surroundings. One of the students looked at the whole space, this whole garden, she interpreted it as a narrative, and she thought that in the back corner it looked like youth, that everything is budding and growing, but it's very cultivated and taken care of. And then as you move diagonally across the garden, you get to the great Tagiusho tree, which has burst into many different branches and is unpredictable and reaching towards daylight. And she thought that that was a perfect metaphor for the upcoming year at Cornell.